Welcome to the Ovation Healthcare Learning Institute podcast, your source for informative and inspiring conversations around the world of healthcare. Hear from the individuals and organizations making a positive impact on the industry and bettering the health and economic wellness of their communities. In each episode, we bring together thought leaders, healthcare professionals, and industry experts to discuss the latest trends, technologies, and best practices. Whether you're a provider, a patient, or simply interested in the ever-evolving world of healthcare, this podcast offers valuable insights across the entire care continuum. Subscribe today and be a part of the Ovation Healthcare journey.
Hey everyone, thrilled that you're here to join us as we talk about the dynamic landscape of healthcare, specifically related to the new world that we live in where cyber risks and threats are as prevalent as ever. I am today's host, and I'm happy to be here. I am Hailey Meadows. I'm Vice President of Business Development for Ovation Healthcare. In today's episode, we'll be speaking with Ovation's President of Spend Management, Josh Sandler, and Lockton's Senior Vice President of Financial Services, Kevin Hewgley. They are going to walk through the key cyber threats hospitals face today and the steps that we can take to protect ourselves and our patients from those threats. Josh Sandler currently leads Ovation Healthcare's Spend Management Solutions division, focusing on both the unique needs of rural hospitals and independent health systems. In his role, he has responsibility for supply chain operations, strategic sourcing, pharmacy optimization, account management, and other expense management solutions such as benefit programs, capital lifecycle management, and facilities across our 175 members with over 1,500 locations. Kevin Hewgley manages the National Financial Services Healthcare practice at Lockton, bringing over 20 years of knowledge in executive risk and professional liability management. With a strong track record of managing complex, fast-paced situations, Kevin is adept at working with senior executives to assess and mitigate risks. Kevin, Josh, thank you both for joining me today.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
And happy to be here, Hailey.
To get us started, Kevin, as the expert here in this space, can you just give us a brief introduction of what you see as the biggest threats facing our healthcare system today from a cybersecurity perspective?
Absolutely. So I think in short form, probably the single greatest threat that we're seeing and probably the highest profile in the news, in particular the last few years, has been ransomware events. And it's threat actors primarily coming from Eastern Europe or the former Soviet Union bloc, and they are very public in their intent on targeting and focusing healthcare as an industry, but in particular, independent rural hospitals, physician groups, and smaller organizations. So it's no longer a mindset that it has to be a very large organization that's a target. Traditionally, employees have been the biggest exposure, and if you think about what we refer to as business email compromise, it's the unintentional or accidental clicking on the link that has the Trojan horse or the virus, or enables the threat actor to gain access into a hospital or health system's network. This is the first year that the last 12 months has been the first time that ransomware events has actually eclipsed business email compromise events. But at the same time, it's also been interesting because 2025 has shown us that the trend in actually paying ransoms has dropped off dramatically. And it's now over 40% of all organizations are no longer paying ransoms. So it is a significant turn in the industry, and it is something that everyone's watching very closely.
Josh, would you like to add anything from your experience?
Yeah, no, Kevin said it well. I mean, I think, hospitals are at greater risk today with all the interoperability of the equipment that they're leveraging today and the use of EMR. So there's access to a lot of that data, whether it's through your MRI or CT, your lab equipment, or even IV pumps. Because they're connected to your EMR, there's a lot of access points for threats to kind of penetrate essentially your information.
And Josh, that's a great point. A quick follow-up comment on that is we've actually seen firsthand some ransomware events where, because of the extensive interconnectedness of hospitals and healthcare organizations, where we've actually seen the ransomware threat. So think where the threat actor, you have to love it, you have to give them credit. They prefer to be called threat actors and not terrorists, but in reality, they're terrorists. But they gain access, and you'll get this message that says, we've locked your system down, you have to pay a ransomware, we have a key. And we've actually seen, because of that interconnectedness through the VHR and the EHR and EHI systems, we've actually seen that push message landing on durable medical equipment. So think patients sitting in dialysis or on surgical monitoring screens. We've actually seen the screens during surgery go dark, and then all of a sudden that terrorist ransomware message appears on the screen or appears on the dialysis pump. So it can be incredibly pervasive because of that unique nature of healthcare being so interconnected.
Yeah, I think, just putting ourselves in kind of the patient shoes, you want these advancements in technology, but it also comes with the other side of that coin, which is the risks associated with that interoperability or the interconnectedness, like you talk about, Kevin. And I think as an employee too, you can definitely resonate with the emails that you see come across that are, more clickbait, and they sometimes look incredibly similar to things that you've seen in an everyday environment. So I'm sure that our listeners can resonate with that. And I think just across the board, the term cyber attack is something we just hear a lot more. I know you mentioned that paying ransom was down, but I think everyone is just familiar with that type of language and that verbiage as the risks have become more complex and higher over the years, really in any industry, but especially when personal health information is on the line. Can you walk us through what you typically see that happens after a cyber attack at a healthcare facility, both on the legal side and then also on the financial side?
Yeah, so generally speaking, what happens is it tends to be the CTO, the Chief Technology, or CIO, Chief Information Officer, or the CISO, the Chief Information Security Officer, will receive the initial notice. In some cases, they'll go directly to the executive or the CFO in charge of the organization. But generally speaking, what they want to do is they want to get the attention of the technology team and make it a tech issue. And so the awareness is the very first thing that happens. It's who gets the notice, and then how do they respond from there. And I'll tell you, the biggest disconnect that I see, in particular with rural health in FQHCs and other more independent organizations, is they don't have a true business interruption, business continuity plan. The IT teams absolutely do. They, in most cases, have mapped out levels of degrees of events, whether it's a significant event or a minor event, whether it's a HIPAA reported event or it's something they can handle internally. So most IT departments have a really good grasp on that. Where we see a huge disconnect in the first matter of hours is how does the IT team engage with the executive leadership team? When do they need to be made aware? Obviously, in a ransomware event, as soon as people start trying to log in, they're made aware of the incident, or they don't even have the ability to log in and to communicate. One of the other issues that we see from the onset is those same independent hospitals, FQHCs, rural hospitals, rural health, physician groups, all of a sudden will find that they have no ability to communicate. So the system's taken down completely, and interestingly enough, in the last couple of years, more and more organizations, in a cost-saving measure, have started doing web-based calling. They'll use free web-based systems, and because they have no access to their internet or intranet access points, they can't even communicate by a phone. And so we see these organizations, in particular the smaller ones, that really struggle with how do we communicate? Who makes the decisions? When does this move from the IT team to the executive leadership team? So phase one, the immediate response, is the awareness. From there, it's the escalation process. So when do we need to have decision makers brought in? When do we need to notify the proper authorities? When do we need to let our broker and our insurance company know? Do we need to engage public relations? Do we need to bring in an outsourced defense firm to start guiding us on an OCR response that we may inevitably have to file? So, and that's even before you start getting into the decisions around forensic selection and other firms. But once it's moved from IT to executive, we also start seeing an inherent disconnect, because from the executive level, they want to mitigate and move very fast. And so a lot of times they're not taking into consideration the inevitable OCR response, or they're trying to make decisions on the fly because they've got to restore and return patient engagement and care as soon as possible. So you get this tension that exists between the two. And I say those organizations that fail to practice or prepare are really setting themselves up for a significant failure themselves. And so moving from that corporate issue into the responsibility and then starting to select vendors and messaging the event is the next phase. And again, if you don't have that plan and you don't even know how to message, it becomes very obvious rather quickly the inherent disconnect. And then, believe it or not, you can set yourselves up for class action lawsuits, federal regulation or oversight, regulators that want to start doing investigations on their side. So it's really bringing all these pieces together and trying to make a decision on the fly. And then you start looking at, do we have insurance? How does the insurance apply? What control do we have? What control does the insurance company have? So there's a lot. And unfortunately, everything I just mapped out, I've actually seen play out in as short as a 2 or 3, 4 hour period of time from start to finish there. So without exception, they become overwhelmed. And you can tell almost instantly who does or does not have a plan in place.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. So, Kevin, you're kind of talking about first assessing where your risk might lie, and then you're saying, build an emergency preparedness plan for where your risks are, right? Is that kind of the building blocks that you're speaking of?
Yeah. And the natural point where I try and advise all my clients to do it, almost every hospital has what I would refer to as a deadlies plan or 7 deadlies plan or an incident response plan. So if you think about when you have to shut down your ED or your emergency rooms, a lot of organizations know how to do that, or they know how to handle a power outage, or they know how to handle a fire or an earthquake, or believe it or not, even gang-related incidences out front of the hospital or terrorist threats. So they have a really good plan in place for that. What they haven't done is connected that plan to what happens when you have a ransomware event or a network outage event.
Absolutely. I think that makes sense. And it's likely something that we've all seen at the hospitals that we work with as well. And, you hope you never have to rely on those plans. And, so sometimes they're maybe not up to date with, the things that they need to have in there, just as the time comes. So you mentioned something in the plan earlier around insurance. And those types of benefits. I know that obviously Lockton is a company that provides some of those solutions. Can you talk through cyber liability insurance, kind of back to the basics, what it is, how it applies, and how healthcare leaders may need to think about their liability insurance differently today than they would have in the past?
Yeah. I would say the overwhelming majority of hospitals now buy some type of cyber coverage, whether it's standalone or it's combined with their HPL medical malpractice coverage or in some other form or fashion. With that said, we just finished a survey of 100 hospitals. We had 81 of them respond. And of those 100 hospitals, we inquired from the CISOs and IT directors and CIOs, have you ever seen your cyber insurance policy or reviewed it? And believe it or not, out of all of those, we had one that came back and said yes, which is concerning because this is their ultimate stopgap measure when they do have an incident. So organizations that have the coverage in place fail before they ever have an event because they don't know how the coverage works. They don't know what the requirements are under the insurance, whether they have the ability to select a forensic firm or a defense firm, or if that falls to the responsibility of the insurance company. So I always encourage my organizations ahead of time, know what coverage you have, spend some time with your brokers to understand how it works. What are the nuances? Does your broker offer a tabletop exercise, or will they provide a session for your executive leadership to walk through how claims might work, how the insurance would respond? But I started as an underwriter over 30 years ago in this space. And it was intended to respond to things like deep linking and meta tags, which ironically underwriters don't even ask anymore. And then it moved into the HIPAA space. When advanced HIPAA regulations came on board, cyber insurance kind of naturally aligned with that, and it was meant more to respond to privacy violations. And really what happened next was the rise of the business email compromises, and the intent of the insurance quickly moved from just privacy coverage to responding to those Trojan horse events, the viruses, network intrusions, ransomware events. And then the coverage really blossomed and matured from there. And it now picks up things like media liability, reputational harm. It picks up business interruption coverage. It can pick up third-party business interruption coverage, regulatory coverage, and even in some cases, technology errors and admissions. Meaning if the hospital or the provider is providing internet services or an EHR platform to a third party, they can have that coverage respond to that as well. But it should be, best-in-class cyber insurance should really be a multi-peril policy meant to cover all of those aspects. And so, ask your broker, do you have a touch point of what's covered, what's not? Let's walk through the insuring agreements of the insurance policy. And I'm surprised a lot of times we'll take over a new hospital and they have no idea what it does or doesn't cover, and they haven't reviewed it, which, this is what I do all day long, so I'm okay reading an insurance policy. Most executives don't enjoy reading an insurance policy. So that's when you've got to rely on your brokers and say, I need you and your team to walk us through the scope of coverage. What is the intent? What is the spirit of the language? Because the hospital has entered into a two-party contract or agreement, which is the insurance policy, with the insurance company. And a lot of times spending hundreds of thousands of dollars, and I have some organizations that spend millions of dollars on cyber insurance, and they don't really even understand what they're buying. So I really encourage my hospitals, my clinics, my FQHCs to really spend the time and understand what that coverage is. When you don't want to know what your scope of coverage is when you have an incident. You need to know that before you have an incident, and that is best practices.
Well, I think that leads me to another question that we've heard from a lot of our hospitals. And for any listeners that don't know, majority of our hospitals are independent health systems or hospitals, sometimes in very rural communities. And they don't know if they need the same type of coverage as a larger hospital system or a large IDN. And, you're saying talk to your broker and understand where your risks are and then what coverage you're paying for. But do you see a major difference in the needs of more independent hospitals or more community-based facilities versus, more urban health systems?
Yeah, great question. The straight answer is no. The risk is the risk. The data is the data. Whether you're on a very large, sophisticated, Cerner-led EHR system or you have your own independent system, it doesn't matter. The federal government and the OCR, and I keep saying OCR and you may not be aware what it's the Office of Civil Rights. That's the regulatory body that responds to privacy events and ransomware events. The OCR could care less whether you're a small independent hospital, a rural health, an FQHC, or a for-profit, publicly traded large health system. The responsibility in any healthcare provider relative to PHI and PII, personal health information and personally identifiable information, is the same. There's no differentiation in the level of standard between the two. What I do see is a lot of the rural hospitals, the independent providers, not understanding that they have the ability to have more expansive coverage. And a lot of times it may not even cost more premium. So I've taken over programs for rural hospitals, and I've said, well, you have no business interruption, you have no business continuity coverage, no reputational harm, no media, and we go out to market. And a lot of times we're successful in adding those coverages in for no cost. You just have to know what you have and what you don't have, and then try and push the market to see what they're willing to give you. And then you can make a value-based informed decision of, okay, we don't have it. The underwriters have come back. It's going to cost X number of dollars in additional premium, but you've made an informed business decision on whether it's worth purchasing that coverage up or not. But in short form, the need for coverage is the same. In fact, I would argue candidly for independent organizations, it's even more important, because the margins for rural health independent hospitals is significantly smaller. And if you have a material event, for some organizations, we've now seen this in the U.S. for the last 3 years, where one ransomware event causes a rural hospital to go bankrupt. They literally have to close their doors because they can't afford the immediate impact and the downstream impact of the event itself.
Well, and I think that's a nice segue. And you kind of answered this question already, but my next question was going to be the concern over cost. I think you think more coverage, more cost, at least initially, but you're kind of saying, talk to your broker, go to market with it, and see what the outcome of that cost is, and relate that back to what the risk cost could be as well.
Yeah, we've been very successful on this front, and a lot of it has to do with our ability to negotiate on a larger scale. With, being a very large broker, the largest privately held broker in the world, we've got the ability to leverage the larger book. And so when we're doing that, for a lot of our independent hospitals and for some of the Ovation clients and themselves, we've been able to save premiums between 30 and 50%, double their limits, expand the scope of coverage significantly. So I always say it's a negotiation point, whether it has additional premium charge to it or whether it's just being able to know how to negotiate and go after the coverage. I say everything's fair game. When I go out to the markets, my underwriters know what my minimum expectations are, and we start from there.
Awesome. Well, Josh, I want to pivot to you for just a second. I think the supply chain department specifically is oftentimes that first entry point for devices and technology that's coming into the hospital. How can we arm our supply chain leaders, not only our C-suite executives, but those folks leading supply chain divisions, to be more aware of what the risks are with these devices and maybe be armed with some better questions to be asking of their vendor partners?
Yeah, well, they should be partnering with their IT department with any acquisition of a piece of equipment or a device that is going to be connected to the EMR or has potential penetration into the network. There's risk assessments for most of these suppliers, common things you'll want to look for, like operating systems, are they going to provide upgrades? Obviously, unsupported operating systems potentially cause more risk, and some of those things that your IT staff will typically have a range of questions that they'll want to know from the supplier about the equipment and what they do to support the equipment remotely in order to help ensure security. A lot of our hospitals also look at refurbished equipment, which presents its own risk. So what are those refurbished companies doing? As you get the equipment, you probably do need to double check to make sure there's no PHI already existing on the equipment, to make sure that that's wiped, which it should be before you install or accept any equipment. So really just partnering with your IT department on those purchases is probably the fundamental thing, because the IT department is going to know what potential risks there are, and they're going to want to have answers to those questions from those suppliers.
And Josh, if I could add a point to that, because that is a phenomenal reminder for me for a significant consideration, is whenever your procurement departments are looking at these significant contracts for either technology or vendor-related services, you need to be negotiating cyber insurance from those providers into your indemnification and insurance components of your contract. That is your front line of defense for additional safeguards and protections. So that is a point that should be taken into serious consideration. And a lot of times procurement and legal and IT are doing that, but it's not necessarily a natural process. So I always encourage my clients to take that into consideration.
Agree, Kevin. We actually have that protection within our agreements for our capital equipment. A lot of our equipment, or anything that's going to connect to your EMR especially, where we require insurance coverage of around $7 million, $7 to $10 million, because the typical incident, I think, was on average costing about $7 million. I don't know if that's gone up or down, but that's what we were seeing on average. So we were trying to ensure that we had protection for any event.
Outstanding. Yep.
Well, I think that's a great outcome and a takeaway for our listeners, specifically around how to look into these agreements with vendors and, make sure they do have that coverage. Kevin, you touched on a couple of success metrics that you've seen in working with our hospitals or other hospitals across the country. Can you elaborate on just a few of those talking points so that some of our listeners can know how you all and Ovation Healthcare can help them?
Yeah, it's not just the process of buying the insurance. Like I tell my clients, I tell my hospitals, I tell them, your relationship with your broker is just as important with your relationship with the carrier. And they should be facilitating and doing things like your incident response plan review, offering tabletop exercises. The engagement with the broker is critical because, surprisingly, the majority of policyholders don't even know that their insurance company is providing them free loss prevention services. They may provide your hospital with external penetration testing or security scans or active monitoring. So a lot of hospitals don't have a 24-hour soccer sim, but the insurance company might be monitoring on their behalf. So have that discussion, understand what the carrier is willing to provide you, A, for free, and B, for any additional discounted fees. They're always heavily, heavily discounted because they're buying on a large scale. And then conversely, your broker should be doing the same thing. What can the broker provide you? And so I know in my seat for my clients, we provide and I cover the cost of pen testing, security scans, full analytics, modeling out for our clients what an event will cost them. I can now tell you with about a 95% degree of accuracy, using your specific hospital's data, what a ransomware event, a network outage event, or a privacy event is going to cost your hospital. It's a much more effective way to buy insurance, but it starts with that engagement with the broker. But you have to have a plan in place. And I encourage my organizations to understand risk assessments and the analytics and the submission process and the application process and the marketing before they ever even bind the coverage. And so I think from that standpoint, you can't just sit back and wait for your broker to bring a single solution to you.
Well, Kevin and Josh, you guys have both covered so many valuable points in this podcast that I know I'm definitely kind of interested in, working with our hospitals more on how they can take a look at this. And I'm sure it's piqued some other people's interest as well. To summarize, just because you have covered so many great things, when we hear about these cyber risks, cyber liability, all of, these things surrounding some of the just cyber world that we live in now, and people aren't really sure where to start. Let's bring it back around to just, if you're a healthcare leader, where should you start, and any first steps that a healthcare leader should take when they're considering or unsure of what their current coverage is, what their risk exposure is, and what they should do about it?
I appreciate this because this is kind of my soapbox issue of where I'm trying to continue to educate my hospitals in particular to support and advance their missions. Rural hospitals are the unsung heroes for the overwhelming majority of the country. And so anything that we can do to kind of support them is critical to our mission. And with that said, I think a couple of key takeaways that I would put forth are, first off, you have every right to request to meet your cyber underwriter. Just ask your broker point blank, may I meet my underwriter? I want to talk to my underwriter. I want to establish a relationship with them. If they're not able to come out in person, do it virtually. The underwriters, believe it or not, absolutely love that opportunity to connect and engage with their policyholders. I've mentioned it several times about understanding your coverage and understanding the services your broker has. But what I'll encourage a lot of my organizations to do is if you're doing your normal renewal insurance meetings, and it includes everything from property to med mal to the general liability and cyber and directors and officers, that's great. A lot of times we'll break out the cyber and do that one separately, and we will include the CISO, the chief technology officers, legal departments if you fortunate enough to have a general counsel on staff. So don't ever hesitate to tell your broker and say, hey, I want to do this independently of the larger renewal because I think there's value to it. And then my other two takeaways that I say that are critical is this absolutely must be a board level engagement exercise. I cannot emphasize that enough. Rural hospitals in particular, a lot of times feel like taking these types of issues to the board is going to create either an awkward or uncomfortable conversation. And what we're finding is it's still the number one concern for CEOs, CFOs, and board chairs. Cyber events, cyber liability, and the security of your data and your patient's data is the number one concern. So if your board currently does not have a working committee to discuss and understand your security exposure, your security footprint, your insurance needs, and your risk tolerance, you're behind the eight ball. And it's not a heavy lift. It really isn't. Whether it's quarterly or biannually meeting and reporting up to the board, what your current security profile and insurance is. The reason why we encourage this is because they can assist in the facilitation of maybe additional support around funding to or relationships with significant vendors in the space to improve the hospital's security footprint and profile. Board level engagement is just critical. interestingly enough, there are some studies out there that say, other than bankruptcy for a rural health provider, this is the number one way for a CEO to lose their job, is when a ransomware hits. And so having your board in your corner is critical, but it also facilitates that conversation point, because let me be very, very clear on this. When a hospital has a ransomware event and they have to redirect their emergency departments, and they can't take life flight hospitals, and they have to close down scheduled procedures, the first people that are going to be breathing down an executive's neck is the board. What's going on? What are you doing? What do you have in place? What's the plan? Who's communicating? And so it's just an additional level of pressure. And so that board level engagement is critical. And then my final point I'll say is, within that exercise, rural hospitals really need to start pressing their brokers and the underwriters in their larger community to understand emerging risks. We're not even touching on artificial intelligence. It's so pervasive on every level in healthcare, but also even starting the conversations around vendor management and what is your hospital's exposure to your vendors, because you're not the only targets out there. I would now say probably half of our policyholders, the event is not theirs. It's caused by a vendor, a downstream vendor that has had an event, and they now have been pulled into it. So again, understanding, does your insurance even respond in a circumstance such as that? So those would be my 5 critical takeaways that I would try to put in front of my clients on a daily basis. It's a lot, I know, but hopefully this assists in their understanding.
There's definitely some great takeaways there, and some things for us all to think about as we go forward. For everyone listening, Lockton has been a very trusted partner of Ovation Healthcare now for a while. And I just really want to thank you, Kevin, for sharing your time, your expertise, and your advice.
Appreciate your time, Kevin. It's always great to have your expertise on the call.
Likewise, we appreciate the opportunity. And again, anything that we're better together, and knowledge is power, and the more we know, the better off we'll be. So anything that we can do to support your hospital or your client's missions is ours. That's our intent. So we're happy to assist on any level.
Awesome. Well, thank you both again. For our listeners, don't forget to follow us on LinkedIn at Ovation Healthcare. And if you found this episode interesting and would like to learn more, please visit us at ovationhc.com. Thank you.